We're all gearheads here, as Atari Archive looks at Dragster. My last video's game, Fishing Derby, was a unique experience in the gaming space. The same can't exactly be said for the other three titles Activision debuted with. Atari's first-party releases to this point are predominantly made up of arcade conversions and takes on real-world activities. And with today's game, Dragster, David Crane covered both of those bases for his new company. Dragster is, at its core, based on the sport of drag racing, where drivers run short straightaway races in incredibly fast cars, often needing parachutes to slow down when the races are finished. Once a popular activity on actual busy streets with modified cars in the mid-20th century, drag racing eventually started moving into dedicated quarter-mile tracks known as drag strips in the 1950s, and even seeing formal racing leagues form up. The oil crisis and subsequent move by auto companies towards less beefy, more fuel-economical cars in the 1970s dramatically shrunk the accessibility and interest in this subgenre of racing, but for game designers and players from that period, it's not a stretch to imagine that they were aware of its heyday and were interested in ways to relive it. Unsurprisingly, drag racing would prove to be a good fit for arcade games, not only because driving games were easy to grasp in car-centric societies, but because drag racing intentionally allowed for fast sessions. Allied Leisure produced a projector-based drag racing game in 1971 for 2 players, and in the era of video games, Electra Games released Eliminator 4, a 4-player take in April 1976. Eliminator 4 brought with it a gear shift, a component missing from Allied Leisure's earlier game, and a key component to a drag race. As with little in way of obstacles on the road, being able to manage your gears and acceleration is truly what separates winners and losers. This game may even have been the inspiration for an unreleased 4-player drag racing game for the Bally Professional Arcade that appeared in early advertisements. Eliminator 4 would not stand alone in the genre and the video game space for long, as in the summer of 1977, 2 more takes on the sport would be released. On the home console front, Fairchild published their Drag Race cartridge for the Channel F around August. Taking advantage of the console format, Drag Race for the Channel F allowed players to select what kind of car they wanted to drive, really just changing how they accelerate, their top speeds, and making it harder to avoid a blowout. It even provided a way to run single-player races by having an option that immediately has the second car stall out. Acceleration is handled by twisting the controller knob, and shifting gears involved simply moving the knob into one of 4 cardinal corners of its square movement space, not unlike an actual shifter. Whoever the developer on this cartridge was, they did a good job of translating these races to the limited hardware. Over on the arcade front, Atari published the identically named Drag Race in June of 1977, and looking at it, you can immediately tell that this is where David Crane got his inspiration. Yes, Dragster is as close to a conversion of Drag Race as you can get on VCS hardware. The arcade game is a 2-player race with gear shifting and a little bit of steering to prevent your car from veering off the straightaway into the grandstands. The game gives players a few heats to race against one another, as well as their best times, before calling it a day. It was a minor success for Atari, as Replay magazine notes that it was the 4th hottest game from their November 1977 edition, and Keith Smith of the All in a Color for a Quarter blog estimates 1,900 units were sold. Compare this arcade game to Crane's take on the VCS, which features a 2-player race between drivers with the exact same visual perspective, gear shifting, and on the harder difficulty, the need to steer your car so you don't careen into the stands. Unsurprisingly, Atari named Dragster specifically in its 1980 lawsuit against Activision, that would ultimately be tossed out a year and a half later. Crane does not hide the fact that Dragster was based on Drag Race, but said it was a tricky conversion given the limits of the hardware. Having to compress the accelerator, steering wheel, and gear shift of the arcade game into the VCS joystick was the most challenging aspect of the design, he explained. And it is actually pretty impressive. The button functions as your accelerator, but for shifting gears, the player has to push the joystick left to clutch and letting it go back to neutral to shift up a gear. Downshifting isn't possible. If you're still accelerating while shifting your car, you will blow out the engine, as will allowing the green and red bar, your tachometer, to fill too far. Crane said he worked on the powertrain simulator for the cars to try and make it feel as realistic as possible as you accelerate and shift. If you choose to play the second game type on the cartridge, the steering functionality from the arcade game is implemented, with your car drifting up and down its lane and the player having to periodically push or pull the stick to keep it on course. While this is a decent enough addition to keep the game interesting, even the default can be plenty engaging just by racing against your own best times. In comments collected on the defunct website GameGrid, Crane elaborated further on the game's development, noting that the game owes its existence to new programming techniques that allowed for a high-resolution score display that Crane, in turn, was able to convert into the Dragsters themselves. Dragster was a big hit for Activision, with Crane noting that it sold more than 500,000 copies in its first year and accounted for half of Activision's total revenues in 1980. While the initial review of it in the Pages of Video magazine's Arcade Alley column referred to it as the least of Activision's initial offerings, Crane relayed an anecdote about an Activision sales rep's son who told him that he'd been playing the game for 35 hours straight before it had even hit store shelves. With each race lasting only a handful of seconds and the game allowing players to jump right back in with the tap of a button, Dragster was the perfect fit for people aiming to try and improve their time, little by little. It's this high score, or in this case, low time, chase that brings us to the part of Dragster's legacy where it intersects with the history of competitive video games. Dragster is the first of Activision's games to offer up a commemorative patch to anyone who could get a time under 6.5 seconds and sent in a photo proving it. At the time of the game's publication, David Crane's remarks in the manual note that the world record was 5.61 seconds. When Activision began publishing high-score records in their newsletters the following year, 5.61 seconds was indeed held by a father and son duo. By the winter 1982 edition, the record had dropped to 5.57 and was held by a trio of players, including teenager Todd Rogers, and a fourth player joined them in the fall. Finally, in December 1982, Activision published a new record of 5.51, noting elsewhere in the newsletter that Rogers had gotten it. He wasn't the only person to claim this time, according to the spring 1983 edition, but Rogers had been a prolific high scorer at the time in several Activision titles, and would go on to leverage this into a championship player identity in the years after claiming this record. On his personal website, Rogers said he was able to beat Activision's own computer-simulated record time of 5.54 seconds by popping the clutch the second the light turned green to start off in second gear. An investigation into the game's code by the person known as OmniGamer found that this was impossible, and even the computer simulation time of 5.54 that Rogers talked about wasn't doable. 5.57 seconds is indeed the lowest possible time for Dragster. This ultimately led to Rogers' scores being invalidated by the high-score tracking site Twin Galaxies. Whether or not Rogers was cheating, though, Dragster, alongside other early games like Asteroids and Space Invaders, was an early pioneer in what would eventually morph into the modern esports realm. Dragster may indeed be one of the leanest games Activision sold on the VCS, but with a game loop on par with something you'd get out of a mobile game, it has held up remarkably well. This isn't the last time Activision's developers would take a minor or unreleased Atari arcade property and produce a massively successful VCS take on it, as we'll see next time. But with Dragster, you have to admit, they were pretty good at it. Next time, we get in the ring.